What we want to do is engage. We want to have a free flow of information back and forth. This is ELC is all about collaboration and us learning. Learning about what the federal government's doing with cloud and law enforcement, and learning what they're doing with federal, state, local, tribal, international, private sector sharing, or maybe not private sector sharing, and how the cloud either causes some of our law enforcement partners to shiver or some of our law enforcement partners to embrace, right? And what's the difference between a law enforcement entity at the local level really embracing a cloud vendor or some of those that are dealing with in my home program who are throwing rocks at us. So I'm going to introduce our speakers. If you want to tweet this, the hashtag is ELC 2013. Feel free to tweet away. And with that, I'm going to ask our panelists to talk a little bit about the types of things they're providing for the federal law enforcement in the cloud, and then I'm going to go around to ask questions. And so I think part of this is about understanding what's in the cloud, what's in either a private or a public cloud, and if there's any transition into public cloud, what you're dealing with. And so I'm going to start with John, who's a great friend and a technologist at the FBI. So John.
Great. Thank you. Okay, just to start with a little bit, I want to give you a little bit of background about how the FBI interacts with the law enforcement community for those who don't know. So we have an arm of the FBI, division of the FBI called CJIS, the Criminal Justice Information Services, that's out in West Virginia. Many of you have heard of that. Certainly anybody in law enforcement has heard of CJIS. And CJIS is really a partnership between the FBI and 18,000 law enforcement organizations, federal, state, local, tribal, around the country. And everything we do out at CJIS involves some cooperation between those partners. I don't know if many of you have been to our website. I can give you a little bit of homework to do. This is a great thing to check out either while you're listening or afterwards. If you go to FBI.gov, in the upper right corner we have a little search area. Type in CSP. CSP stands for CJIS Security Policy. The CJIS Security Policy is on the web for anyone to read, and it is basically the culmination of all the concerns, security concerns from the entire law enforcement community that works with CJIS or shares at the federal level. This is a cloud-friendly security policy. So those of you who haven't read it yet and are interested in your own organizations in terms of just kind of sorting out what's good, bad, ugly about the cloud. This is something where we try to tackle all the issues of security. Also up there we have some great white papers on security in the cloud and some technical papers, as well as something we'll talk about a little bit later, which is a model for how we evaluate cloud services. So that's just kind of a bit of an introduction. Now, CJIS itself operates what we call community clouds. And these are clouds that we provide on behalf of all the law enforcement, 18,000 law enforcement organizations throughout the country. So it's a little bit of a microcosm of what you see out there in public cloud space. But they're very much like, they have all the same kind of security concerns that you would find in any kind of outsourced cloud. And to give you a sense, we got a couple, the Index program, which is the National Data Exchange. We also have NCIC, the National Criminal Information Center. So you can think about these as a partnership among trusted organizations, trusted law enforcement organizations. So we've been in the cloud business for a while. I mean, we kind of joke that we've been in the cloud business since 1924, but the actual technology didn't catch up until relatively recently. So these issues of cloud have been something that we've, in terms of outsourcing technology, has been on our minds for quite a while. So we can provide some good perspective on this topic.
Great. I'm going to do the bookend approach. So Bernie Mazur is the CIO for the Department of Interior, significant law enforcement entity, although we don't often think about it that way. So Bernie, just tell us a bit about what you're doing with the law enforcement in the cloud from the DOI perspective.
Okay, good morning everyone. as you probably noted, that the Department of Interior probably has the second highest amount of law enforcement officers within the federal government. They're distributed within the Park Police, the Parks, Fish and Wildlife, Bureau of Indian Affairs, BLM. So we have law enforcement officers throughout the 2,000 locations and all that we're stewards for within the public lands in the United States. Regarding the aspects within cloud, during the shutdown, as we identified prior to the shutdown, the Department of Interior was severely hit by the shutdown. Over 80% of its workforce were furloughed, but we managed to maintain law enforcement as well as public safety officials still maintain the protection of life and property type of activities. And one of the things that we looked at was an examination of the critical applications that needed to be maintained within the Department of the Interior. One of those critical applications that needed to be maintained was something we called IMARS, which is the Incident Management Analysis Reporting System, which is a department-wide law enforcement application that looks at all facets of law enforcement activities. That happened to be, during the shutdown, I monitored every day the usage as well as the reliability and the uptime of all the applications. The IMARS application was the second most heavily used application during the shutdown activities. So we had our folks in, whether it was the Bureau of Indian Affairs that were looking at jail custody types of activities, incident reporting in the parklands, as well as fish and wildlife refuges. So it was a heavily utilized application that we were using. I don't want to mix up public, private, or community clouds, but the IMARS application is maintained within the Department of the Interior. It was formerly the application is run by our colleagues in the Office of Law Enforcement and Emergency Management Services, but it's hosted within the Interior Business Center. But starting on 1 October, the infrastructure activities are being supported by the OCIO. We have a pretty good idea of all the things that are going on within the IMARS, but we use VPN solutions and all that for the folks out in the field, and we're doing a modular approach in terms of bringing in applications or types of applications, whether it's SARS or the links with NCIS and all of that.
Greg and I worked at the Department of Homeland Security together a little bit, and he has since moved over to the Department of State. He's the Director of Consular Systems and Technology. So Greg, how are you using cloud in sort of your aspect?
Okay, thank you, Donna. And I would say here, speaking from the Department of State, more on the public safety side of the description of the session. So of course in Consular Affairs we own the systems that are used to manage visas for visitors to the United States, passports for American citizens as they travel, as well as the overseas citizen services systems that are used in consulates and embassies when the traveling public goes to a consulate or embassy seeking assistance. We also operate travel.state.gov, which provides a lot of publicly available information, travel alerts and warnings, information about passports, visa information for those seeking the information about obtaining a visa. And what we are doing at this point is pushing as much to the cloud as we possibly can. Now, of course, the FedRAMP process supports moderate or below. Many of the services that we operate are above that, but we do have several that are moderate or below, and travel.state.gov fits within that space. In fact, we have an answer to the Open Data Initiative that's been rolled out. We have a couple APIs that are about to go public to provide access to travel alerts and warnings that we've built just within the last 3 months. So providers who would like access to that information would be able to come in and request a complete file, or perhaps specific information about using the key management server, which is all open source solution that, again, would be pushed to the cloud. And we continue in many of our modernization projects to look at what can fit into the cloud, what is information that other agencies or governments would like access to, and leverage those cloud capabilities where possible.
So thank you. Great, good to see you again. Always fun to work with you. So I'm going to sort of give you a situation I sat through this past 18 months, and then I'm going to challenge the esteemed panel to help me do better on this. So in my portfolio in the Department of Homeland Security is the little program, little engine that could, the program that people either love to love or love to hate, mostly on the love to hate side when I took it over, is the Homeland Security Information Network Program, HISIN. And so over the past 30 months, we took a look at the old technology, rolled out new technology, and with that new technology came a requirement for every user I migrated, all of the 56 or so thousand users, to go through some level of an identity management, identity proofing process, so that as I provisioned them an account, I knew who they were, and every time they log in now, I know that they are who they are because we're bounding that identity proofing to some sort of second factor authentication. You would have thought I started World War III with the law enforcement community. I got a lot of pushback. Why do you need me to tell you how much I'm paying my mortgage for? I have a gun and a badge. Can't you just trust me? Why do I have to go through this process? I have a gun and a badge. Have this process. And so as much as we explained a gun and a badge is awesome, but if you put them in the computer, it doesn't really work. That we needed some form of identity that we could trust. It took us a while to get through that education process. So I would say, without going through the painful identity proofing process, how can we do better to get our state, local, international, private sector partners, law enforcement partners, onto a cloud-based system with some level of integrity? And so I'm going to start with maybe John, if you have any ideas.
Certainly be happy to do that. Actually, I'm going to make a bold claim. I don't know about 1924, because I wasn't around then, but I can tell you that I believe I had the most experience and the longest experience with cloud computing of anybody on the panel. As a young NCO in 1970s for the Air Force, I was in charge of night shift on a data center. We had a big barn-sized computer. And it was in this giant climate control rooms, and people would input their data, and at night would bring me stacks of holler cards, right? And I'd sit there and provide those. I'd run those through and provide those out the back end to them the next morning. I had no idea I was providing software as a service, and then people would put in information online, at these little centers, and there's not many people as old as I am in this room. You're a lot younger than I am. But they'd sit there and put in this information on these twisted copper pair that came into the data center. I was into virtual computing. We just call them dumb terminals. So, this whole computing model is what was old is new again. So when somebody says cloud, I get a bit of a chuckle about that. I ran cloud computers in the 70s, but we had lousier marketing, so it was all about that. So there's this real interesting set of problems that we address, especially when you talk about law enforcement. There's a key word here that challenges all of us when we talk about information sharing and law enforcement. That word is jurisdiction. Law enforcement agencies are concerned and have to be concerned with legalities and issues of jurisdiction. So how do we take that, put that into this publicly provided environment, and how do we do that in a way that provides the trust that you alluded to? First thing you have to figure out is what's a technology problem, what's a policy problem, and what's a cultural problem. And that's always the biggest challenge. If you're familiar with the Serenity Prayer, people talk about that of St. Francis. Lord, help me accept the things I can change. Help me change the things I can, and for God's sakes, I want to know the difference. So, and this is what we really have to do. We've got a lot of people that confuse, policy issues with technology issues. And there's many great things we can do now with technology. But the challenges we'll get out there is understanding what those distinctions are and ensuring we define the policy, the cultural challenges, and then implement them with technology. And I think right now, that's where we really need to be, is defining this process. Not in the rush to get to cloud, let's step back a minute, take a look, and make sure we define the problem correctly.
So can I poke on this a little bit? So when I got pushback from the law enforcement community,
Sure.
who had no other way, I had no other way to verify who they were, because their state and local entities weren't providing identities. Was it a cultural pushback I was getting in order to go through an identity proofing process? One that we go through to get our credit reports, one that we go through to sort of interact with lots of internet companies today. So is that a cultural problem, and how could I have maybe done a better job?
Well, I don't know if you could have done a better job, but you used a word that's significant. That is trust. when you say trust, if you look at what we do in the government to assist trust, I've been through that too. I was a former, I worked at NSA for a number of years up in Fort Meade. And you know what? We had to go through a trust issue too. We have trust issue with computing, but we have trust with people. Now what the government does a lot, they do something called polygraph. All right, which is speed dating for government employees. So what the polygraph does is forces you to have and develop a quick level of trust, is exactly what you said. So the challenge that we have culturally as we look across this is determining where that trust exists and how we do that in our institutions that we have. And so that challenge is exactly right. It's not a technology problem that you have right now, although adaptive authentication solutions like you've adapted are critical to that. So how do we both do it from a cultural as well as from a policy perspective first in order to understand what technology problems we have to overcome later?
So, awesome. No tips on saving me from my...
Hey, we've all been up against that windmill.
So let me sort of ask a question here, maybe of Mr. Mazur. If you're sort of entertaining moving some of your private services to a public cloud, what are the top 3 things that you're really evaluating as you move that forward? Not just the FedRAMP sort of controls, but what are you really looking at when you move, if you were to sort of entertain moving some of your private services into a more public offering?
Well, what we're looking at is, in addition to the IMARS activity is, we've embarked upon quite a few efforts to move activities, applications, infrastructure, everything as a service. We're examining the whole environment as to what can be moved out into the cloud. We've just established our emails out in the cloud, or we have an electronics records management system that's out in the cloud. Our financial system, the infrastructure is hosted out in the cloud. We're moving our workflow activities out in the cloud. We have quite a few of our scientific types of applications that interact a lot with universities and local partners. They are being moved out into the cloud. We've established a cloud foundational hosting contract. It's a $10 billion contract that allows us to look at that. When I'm looking at things in terms of what merits consideration for moving out into the cloud, there's a couple of things. One is assessing the cloud model and then developing a comprehensive understanding of what that current marketplace is for that particular service that we're being provided. 2 is, as we're saying, this merits consideration as an alternative analysis to move something out in the cloud, is then to prepare whatever the particular application and services that are going to be, the applications that are going to be moved out to there. And there's a couple of subsets there. One is like how we go about standardizing the workloads in the infrastructure, what kind of degree of virtualizing that we're looking at, and then also how do we optimize the particular architecture there. And then 3 is how we kind of like do some piloting and deploying of that cloud service particular model for there. And some of the things that we're looking at is how we do automatic provisioning of that particular service. Because one of the merits of cloud is the scalability and the surge on demand on that. Also a secondary thing to that is how we do integrating the management. This really comes to when we're talking about data and who has the ownership of those activities. And then the third is about looking at workload-dependent types of cloud models that were going on in terms of that.
To push on that conversation I had with John a little right before here, the FBI trades information, has trading partners with 18,000 police departments and probably some international partners as well. I would estimate that some of those are entities who are working from some form of a cloud capability, sharing information with Index or sharing information with NCIC. Is there a framework that you use to evaluate someone connecting their cloud to your cloud? And can you talk about that?
Yeah, so we developed a framework with the partners, which is available again on the web for anyone to read. And it's the Cloud Infrastructure Evaluation Model, CIEM, and you can do a search also on FBI.gov. It'll take you there. And basically, it's similar to. I'm not going to. It's somewhat repetitive with FedRAMP analysis, but we kind of broke down the potential of a cloud into nine layers, kind of looking everything from the sort of the lowest layer networks. So the networks actually between the devices within the cloud. Then you got infrastructure. You've got your sort of infrastructure as a service portion. You've got your your platform as a service portion, which would be things like databases and applications and presentation layer for applications. And then at the very top, it would be if there's some kind of special interface to get into the cloud, those sort of layers. And it doesn't mean that every cloud service provider or every option out there, whether it's a government run or a public solution, is a private solution rather, is going to have all 9 of those. They may not all be there. And it may not be that you're interested in all 9 of those scenarios. So we might have a state or local who's interested in sort of infrastructure as a service. So they're really looking at putting data in the cloud, but they're going to be managing a lot of the analytics and things above that layer. Or they're going to manage all of the infrastructure related to identity management and that sort of thing. So, but in any case, with each layer of these, we've got a sort of a checklist that you would go through as a potential user of a cloud service to say, okay, asking the important questions. For example, at the lower layer, where is the data stored? Who has access to the data? Is information logged somewhere? Who has access to that? Does the information that's logged have metadata that might be interesting? And so you go through this evaluation process, and there may be scenarios where you can't meet all of the requirements, or it doesn't, on the surface meet all the requirements. And then one of the things you might have to do is say, okay, for that layer within that cloud service, encrypt data. So we've been doing this we've been sharing services for a long time with private industry. So we've been doing this for 20 plus years on the networks in the network world, where we're using major vendors to send sensitive data across the internet, across lease line connections, and all those sort of things. So in those world, we don't think twice about what we have to do. We evaluate the scenario. If we need to, we encrypt our data end to end. We encrypt our payloads. We know all of this already. Cloud is just taking us, or when we talk about cloud now, we're really talking about adding in some of those other things like infrastructure as a service, software as a service, platform as a service. So what we've taken is a lot of those concepts for how we used to evaluate networks years ago and added them to these other layers of commoditized services, which these are becoming more of. And if one of our partners is interested, in order to play at the federal level, they must evaluate and prove that the service that they're getting downstream meets the criteria, or that they've done the appropriate risk management to meet the service level. Otherwise, they can't play, and that's just there's some sacrifices you have to make. There's not every provider out there meets the criteria, but more than one provider probably do meet the criteria.
So I had recently a few weeks off from work, and I took that opportunity to renew all of the technology in my house, which was an awesome exercise in understanding things like network storage, accessible storage, what the values are of a very ultralight notebook, and how do you connect the same iPads, iPhones, Androids, TV, a bunch of other things, sort of all together, right? So, and I freaked out when I realized I didn't know where all of my data was. I didn't know where all of my information was. I had maybe about 6 computers, which really is insane because there's 2 people in the house, right? 2 people. And so I spent a lot of time for the 3.5 weeks really trying to find my data and making sure I was putting it into my new personal cloud, so to speak. And I struggled. How many people here use Dropbox? All right, how many people use some other form of a iCloud or Microsoft Cloud or something? Yeah, so I had some data locally, some on a really old notebook that I couldn't turn on, but I needed the data off. And I wanted to sort of make my new iCloud accessible and connected to my Dropbox and to my other things. So data for me was the sort of the lesson of my 3.5 weeks. So I want to sort of poke a little bit. How, if I were just having a problem as Donna Roy with maybe a terabyte of data in my house, not very much, maybe use pictures, things like that. If I struggled over 3.5 weeks, and I'm sort of techno-savvy, how does an entity who's in a cloud provider A really get their hands around moving to a cloud provider B, and how do they really understand how to get their data migrated? So I freaked out, and it really was not meaningful data at the end of the day. So maybe I'll start with my friend from the Department of State. Do you have any ideas on how you would sort of give advice to an entity who wanted to move cloud providers and what they would really need to consider?
Well, it's part of what we're doing, we're figuring out now at the Department of State Consular Affairs with our modernization project that we call Consular One. So the various missions that we support each has a specific system that has been developed over the past 10 or 15 years. And each of them has a different look and feel, different menu system. And we're bringing together all of those capabilities under a common look and feel, a single suite of services to provide rapid access to information to consular officers without going into multiple applications. And a big piece of that is how we manage the data. So 15 years ago, we didn't have the robust networks around the world, and so we have at every post overseas primary and secondary Oracle database servers. And we're looking at moving away from those servers at post that replicate data back to the central database here in the US and come up with a way where we can perhaps regionally deploy cached data that can be accessed by the various posts overseas that need access to that information without having to manage essentially 243 data centers, although it's 2 servers, but it's in every post. And so a lot of what we're doing right now is in that same model. So where we have cloud providers that as discussed earlier, that can provide access to that information today, we're doing that. Where the cloud capability does not exist at the higher level classifications, we're building that in some of our locations overseas, or looking at how perhaps to cache that data.
So I'm going to pick on my friends in the audience now, because I know I can pick on Mark. He was the sort of a bright mind in the world of technology. What do you see sort of on the horizon for technologists who are really looking at this issue around data management in the cloud?
Yeah, good. It's good. Based on it. Thanks for picking up. Great remarks, and you do date yourself when you say Hollerith is even post a punch card. So you get the gray hair crown today, I think. So the discussions which are very illuminating, and I really appreciate the rigor that's evolving now in how we evaluate. But it seems to be I'm looking at not about private cloud or even community cloud, but let's talk about subscribing from public cloud. Most of the discussion seems to be about subscribing from a cloud service provider. The more interesting things that we're seeing now and the more complex are cloud to cloud and multi-cloud. So from me to cloud to cloud to cloud back to me to accomplish a given service or outcome. Are you looking at that? And as we think about federal, state, local, tribal, it seems like that would be of the essence.
Anyone, John? I see you shaking your head.
Well, right. So we don't see, when you talk about cloud, really what we're talking about is outsourcing commodity compute storage in a variety of different ways. So, with our partners, we know that many of them are dealing with different providers. I don't think that that's going to end. I think the big thing we have to think about is sort of data management. What is as you go into any agreement, know your exit plan. All agreements end. All agreements must be flexible. And you need to be thinking about that in 10 years, not just the data I have today. We can't get into a situation with cloud providers where they become too big to fail, because something will happen. And maybe from a law enforcement perspective, what if they get bought by an Iranian company or something where then we are forced to move data out or around. So having the flexibility with multiple capabilities to move data, probably multiple contracts. You need to know that there's other solutions out there that will also work. And if we can be as architecture agnostic as possible when we look at these solutions, I think we'll be in the best shape. And if vendors can be as less proprietary about how we manage, the better off we are. I think that that's going to be something where even if you get all of your services as a federal organization from one place, your partners will work in many places, will work with many different vendors. We need to make sure they're interoperable and all those things. So I think as we look at it, we kind of look at these platforms as commodity compute, commodity storage. Either I do it or someone else does it. I don't think about it as a proprietary solution where I'm trapped. If I do that, then I'm in trouble. And I think over time this will evolve to where there are many potential vendors out there that offer very similar kinds of services where we can shop and either place things in 2 places or more places for vendor, similar to what we do on the network side, right? Going back to that. I mean, often you build a network, you have multiple paths out of your building, you use 2 different vendors, right? Because it's not that they're not, something can happen to one vendor and you're down. You have to think about sort of alternatives. So,
Ernie?
Yeah, I would like to, this is a great question that you asked because it's really about whether it's back to the future about with your holoriths or not. With the advent of cloud, it is really, it's compelling us to think differently and anew on how we really manage information and content. And I'm looking at whether it's our law enforcement activity, and that's I just look at that as a business segment line, which is one of many business segment lines that government entities provide. We're kind of we're coming to grips with a triptych, if you will, about what's the meaning of cloud, and I don't care about the flavors, whether it's public, hybrid, community, or whatever. And then what's the meaning of mobility? Is increasingly we have a mobile workforce. You start to see with the advent of all your devices and everything like that, and look at the trend lines for that, for the mobile devices as compared to where we are with the traditional desktops. What does that mean? And then how do we force applications or have applications over there? And then we got this thing about data. Now within the Department of the Interior is what we're looking at with our foundational cloud hosting contract is we want to have a central management of that so we can come to grips with what all of these different tens of thousands of data sets and what they mean and where there's some value and all that about sharing of the data. You're probably aware of the OMB's or the U.S. government's push for open data. And one of the good things about the push for the open data is that we're looking at is coming to grips with trying to inventory or create structures and all that about where our data is at. Now, admittedly, we're going to be looking at a meta tagging of where that data is, but we're going to start to look at where there's relevance of similar types of data and all that and how it looks at from one area to another. So then what I look at is we're going to have within the Department of Interior as well as some other agencies, we're going to be pushing things out into the cloud, whether it's up to public or a private type of cloud provider. All this kind of data out there, is it still going to be pushed out in the traditional ways of one single channel or not, or are we going to put it out into the cloud so we can see where there are synergies going available for those types of cloud activities? So whether it's like using tools like JSON or HTML5 or whatever those types of things are available, is we're coming to grips about what it means from an architectural perspective, how we're going to looking at that. Now I know there's talk about bringing up brokers because I got my cloud here and this cloud here and that cloud there, and how do we interconnect all those types of things? That's one of the things that we're coming to grips with. All of the contracts that we're doing with our public cloud providers, we do have a portability option that if something does go south with that relationship, that we have the ability to move those types of things there. But we have that ability there. I know when we're looking within the Department of Interior as whether we're moving our data or our applications or our data centers out to the cloud or not, is we're doing an intensive application rationalization of the thousands of applications that we have, and then looking at, there's a couple things. Does it merit consideration of going out to the cloud? Is it similar in terms of what it's doing with other applications that we have? So it's a great, wonderful world that we're trying to come to grips with. There are no answers to the questions that you pose, but there are lots of follow-on questions that are making us think anew about how do we come to grips with these types of things, of liberating the data, and it's also at the same time, particularly in a world like law enforcement and public safety, assuring that there is this modicum of good security that's being applied to it.
So, in my 3.5-week vacation, as I was modernizing my house, I struggled with figuring out where the authoritative source of a particular thing in my house was. I have a favorite picture of my dog. And I've maybe edited it a few times, and I might have a copy on my iPad, might be a copy on my network drive, there might be, something on my phone. And so I struggled to figure out what was my source of truth, what was my authoritative source for that one sort of piece of information. As we move our information around in this cloud to cloud to cloud sort of structure, do you have any thoughts either from the audience or from our panel on how we maintain the sort of the trust in the data as we move it from these clouds, and how do we sort of keep that trust in the data either as the open data initiative or as the more closed public safety data that we want to control access to?
I want to get my 10 points for saying meme in the. Excellent. I mean, certainly. One of the things we like, when it comes to data, is standard XML standards, whether it be NEEM, et cetera. Tracking the pedigree, lineage of data is critical, and having some way to have that visibility attached to data as it moves around, so you know where it came from and what version it is and who's authoritative and that sort of thing. We have an interesting thing in law enforcement that creates some of the sort of the perception headache of outsourcing services, and it's something called chain of custody. And that's one of these things where, if you're all aware of chain of custody, it basically I've gotten something from a crime scene, and by the time it gets to court, it's nobody's changed it. It's been controlled in a clear way where I understand it through that whole process, and I can prove that nothing happened to that evidence. A challenge if you're looking for like a locals or potentially looking at putting evidence into an outsourced environment. We don't do that in our world, in the sharing that we do at the CGIS level. But let's think about that for a moment. Even if you, in those cases, have all the security in the world and can prove that the data was well managed and that you've gotten sworn affidavits from every provider of services that everything was very well done, you're up against, in our case, a court of law where you have individuals like ourselves, and I think about my parents and other people that don't know a darn thing about cloud, and then a defense attorney that comes in there and says, well, at some point along the line, as you use this outsourced provider, how do you really know that you can trust that your evidence didn't get tampered with? So some of these things, it's a little bit beyond your statement, but some of these things, even if you do have things like very good controls, lineage of data, you're up against in some of these for some of these technologies sort of a public perception. And I sometimes wonder in my mind if back in the court cases of the early 20th century, if there was these court scenes where someone comes in and says, "Well, Your Honor, I think that perhaps there was something wrong with this scene. It was illuminated by an incandescent bulb," and that was this idea that technology at the time changes the environment. People don't trust that maybe light came out of incandescent bulbs the same way as it did out of. Trying to bring in the historicness of the room here a little bit. These fake lights up here. So, this is one of the things we'll have to be dealing with for some time, is the perception as well as once we get beyond sort of technology and being able to track data.
I just want to comment on a thing my colleague at the end of the row said when he talked about the Department of the Interior. He said at the end of a very compelling discussion of the use of various cloud capabilities, he said, "Oh, and with a modicum of security." Well, what's that? That's the big challenge. Trust is key to what we do in this business, especially with, my colleague alluded to it here from the FBI. So it's central. It's not just something we tack on at the end. I'm not saying that that's what he meant. Not at all. I know what he meant. But the challenge that we have is embedding the trust in this, and it comes back to something that was said earlier when we talk about this. Well, we're condemning the number of sites that we have these. It starts with actually, it's an evolution. Cloud isn't something we just wake up someday and do or contract to have done. We have to evolve into this environment, and it starts with consolidation in most organizations. Then it moves from that consolidation to an understanding of data. Data is interesting. There's a dated book right now, but it's still really interesting, relevant, written by John Seeley Brown, called The Social Life of Information. And information has interesting characteristics that are similar to people. Information is born, information is matured, it gets married to other information, divorced from other information. But there's a significant difference, the analogy here, between information and people, and that information doesn't die, it has to be killed. So we have to understand, it's absolutely true. And so it's a real challenge that we have as we look across this data is not only what social function does this data serve? And so what I find I struggle with every day, and I work with organizations and government agencies every day that haven't even begun to address that critical question, which is what social function does your data serve? And as we start to address those issues, we can make a much more intelligent case for outsourcing these capabilities to the cloud, then being able to define what those policies are that wrap around that, how to implement those, what are technology implementations, what are policy, and then what do we actually have to do from the human factors, from the people environment. And the right mix of those is what really defines a success going to this environment and moving the data off into these outsourced capabilities.
Yeah, we have to build trust, and we have to also sell the benefits to the individual. Donna, you asked earlier, is it cultural? And I believe it is. We operate information systems, right? Information systems consist of people, processes, and technology. The technology is the easy part, right? People are influenced by culture, processes are influenced by policy, and those two lag technology. People are reluctant to give information to their government. However, they will voluntarily approach a perfect stranger seated at a folding table in the shopping mall and give their most private information, the details of their private lives for a 15% discount and a free umbrella, right? So, we have to change the culture and sell the benefits. For example, the previous panel talked about biometrics, and TSA came up. So people are giving their information because they want to more rapidly go through security at the airport. Right? So why am I doing this? Why should I trust you? You have to make it a little bit more personal. Some are reluctant to give information to the government, but will they give information to public servants who are sworn to protect our neighborhoods, our communities, our country? Would you give it to Donna? Would you give it to John? Right, as opposed to the government.
So I'd like to pull the thread on this a little bit, because I talk about trust in 4 layers. I talk about trust of the people. So when you log into a system, I should know it's you, Gary, you every time. Every time it's you, I know it's you. Trust in the data. I know that the data is what it is. It has a lineage with it. It is the trusted source of truth as we sort of know it. And then I talk about 2 other layers of trust that I've taken out of this use case. So I would just say, Gary, if you would, can you give me your credit card right now? I know you've got one in your wallet, right? You could give me your credit card.
Absolutely.
Right? You could.
Yep.
You could give it to me.
Yep.
Yes, see, give me your
There it is.
Now, I could run out of this room.
Absolutely.
I could run out of this room. And I wonder how much credit runs on this. I could run out of this room. I could
That's
go
for
shopping.
me to
I
know
have
and
my
you to find out.
iPad. I have my iPad with me, right? I could go shopping. I could put this on my Amazon account. I could go buy all my Christmas gifts. But guess what? He's got some process to allow him to be able to trust me and not even see me, to trust me. I could be swiping this, I could be doing a lot of things.
Yep.
He's got a process that he sort of understands. He's got an agreement with his bank, right? So he calls. He cancels everything. He is not liable for the credit,
And that's happened.
right? It has happened
Absolutely.
to me, right?
And
So it's
they
happened to
maintain
me.
the risk, so I don't care. You're welcome to have a field day with that,
So the banks understand a lot about trust.
if you can get ahead of my wife.
The banks understand a lot about the trust of the process, for which, if something happens, how do they prevent the risk and the sort of bad actions, right? And then how do they sort of go after, in a systematic way, fraud or bad actors? So I talk about those other 2 layers as trust and process. There's a process for which I can undo some bad actions. And then some sort of governance, because you can't talk about data without governance. Something that penalizes people for doing bad things, right? So the banks go after, big identity fraud in Europe, right? There's a lot of systematic, people are funding really great activities not so great, really, activities, through credit card fraud and other types of things. So with the banks, they understand this. So let me take you through a scenario and then talk about how we could all increase trust, maybe in the sort of your perspective. I'm a law enforcement professional. Stephen Cooper, maybe back there. I've put some case information into a trusted law enforcement platform. I've put it in trusting that I know that the system has a network of understanding the identity of the people that log in. And they have some way of saying these people are sworn law enforcement officers. So, they're good guys on the good side. I put it in there, and then maybe perhaps someone uses that case information inappropriately and kills my case, right? Kills it. And, I'm incented by closing these cases, so my career is not looking all that good right now, right? So what's the process for which we undo that in a sharing environment where you have federal, state, local, tribal, and national private sector rules for that? And then how do we sort of increase our capability to allow our law enforcement guys to trust that these platforms will get to the place where they can give me their credit card and they understand that their risk is mitigated?
It's good enough.
Right. Any thoughts on that?
I was going to hog the floor. I thought that was a good analogy because that's exactly right. So it's a risk issue that comes back to, we oftentimes use the word security inappropriately. Security is a transitory and idyllic state, like love. All right? There's no such thing as security. And when people talk about having secure systems, it's a pipe dream. They're not happening. What we have to talk about is, do we have the appropriate risk functions? And you brought up a great point about that. This is all about understanding the risk paradigm. What is that risk profile about? It's about threats, vulnerabilities, and assets mitigated by safeguards. And then, I have a mission to accomplish. So how do I sit there and look at these? Right now, what we're seeing in the security environment, we're living in the golden age of threat. Go on any cybersecurity panel, everything else, every geek's up there giving you a threat speech, right? Oh, these hackers and these threats and these that. Look, if I play defense in this business, I have to be concerned about my environmental threats. I have to be concerned about all the human threats. I have to be concerned about external, internal, malicious, non-malicious, insiders, outside. All those have to be factored into this prospect. That will bring us trust. And then openness with government and other capabilities help breed trust, and that's what it has to be in that system. So in government, the challenge, and in law enforcement, again, that goes back to the issue of jurisdiction, who's jurisdictionally responsible. Because the challenge is our law enforcement agencies haven't kept pace with technology. And it's not that they're bad, it's that the way they were set up to deal with things like crime and fraud and everything else, they're just not able to be done in this environment that doesn't know national or tribal or regional boundaries. So we're challenged by that and how to be able to create trust in that environment between these disparate agencies.
Yep.
Well, one thing is the credit card, they spend a lot of money.
And Mike? Oh, thank you, Mark. Knight in shining armor.
When you're now the credit card company, they spend a lot of investment in the back end to detect fraud and patterns of what your big pattern is. And John said he knows something's up with his card, so they call him and say something's up with your card.
Right.
And then we also have the ability, my card's missing, somebody, you gave it to a waiter and they kept it.
Right.
You can shut it down very quickly. So they've put some very good safeguards, both in investment in fraud detection as well as the ability to shut it down quickly.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. Anyone else from the audience? So how many people, and I'll sort of tee this up after I run,
I think that's all.
roving facilitator.
I think also, and I'm not technical, so I can't say for sure, but if you trust the person and that person ends up not being trustworthy, then if you trust the data and to put in safeguards for the data, still if you trust the data, your threat is lessened.
Okay. Anyone else? So how many people shop? I do all of my Christmas shopping on Amazon.com or something similar, right? So I don't go out of my house. I hate Christmas. How many people do shopping online? Right, yeah. Keep your hands up if you actually read the reviews. All right, good part of you. Now, how many sort of filter through those moderate reviews where you've got a lot of bad ones, a lot of good ones, so you buy something even though it's only a 3? So how many people? How many people, right?
Depends on what it is.
Right.
Depends on what it is.
But you're right, that's, yeah.
Right? So why is it we're not sort of applying some of these techniques in our sharing platforms, right? So could we get to the point where we had, in some of these community platforms, could we get to the point where we had the Amazon.com sort of trust in products? Could we build that into the way we share information or the way we sort of build these connections, right? So is it possible? I sometimes buy things that aren't highly rated because they meet a specific need. And I'll read the reviews and I'll say, well, I don't know, that guy sounds like he's just got a problem in general. Or that guy, maybe he didn't even open the box and install it. And so I'll rationalize it because I need it, right? So, but can we get to the place where we've got community sourcing and community input that allows us to get to the same place in the sharing of things like law enforcement data that we've got with the banks, right? So instead of investing all our federal government dollars on some sort of auditing tracking, is there a role for the community to help us sort of either highlight bad actors, people who are providing sort of bad sharing techniques,
The sheriff
or
can go in and
providing bad
goes,
data?
arrested scumbag, recommend AA+, would do again.
So I would just sort of leave the panel with that sort of open. What's the role of community in helping us build trust around the process of sort of putting some of our data in some of these law enforcement clouds?
Looks like they teed that one up for you.
Well, we've talked about this internally quite a bit over the last several years. I'm looking at Gervis because it's a topic that we've talked about in terms of being able to tag data for how much you trust it. So this comes from an iffy source. I'm not really sure. When you work sort of in the analytic environment, you're bringing in data from lots of different places. Probably those of you who don't do analytics and don't do law enforcement, maybe you've been out to one of those like Ancestry or something like that, and you're trying to find your roots, and you go on these sites, and all sorts of people are providing data, and often it's wrong most of the time. In fact, here's a beauty, and there's a corollary here, and I do a lot of these kinds of genealogy. So you can have a scenario where 9 out of 10 people believe someone was born in 1940, and they're all wrong because what they did was they all trusted somebody. Somebody was lazy, and then they just click the button. Yeah, I'll bring this in. I trust that person, so now it's 1940, and then it just builds up to where you get a bad result. And when you got to be careful with sort of community sourcing these types of things. So it's not a matter of volume of how many people think it's that is correct, because sometimes, again, you don't know the process by which each person evaluated the information. Often, it could be that 1 out of 10, that sort of that minority entry, that's the right entry. So what you really have to do is not just sort of the trust of the data, the trust of the individuals providing the information. What we do in the genealogy world, of course, is we provide sources. We say, where did I get that information? And this source is here. It's not, the source is not Joe, another person on the website. The source is this document, and this document has, there's certain things that maybe aren't perfect documents. Some things like birth records are probably pretty accurate. They can be wrong too. But you've got that sort of lineage where you can see the source of the information and whether you trust it, whether the person did a good job, whether the analyst, in the case of in our world, did a good job of linking to the sources. So there's got to be sort of a play of being able to tag data for confidence level, but you need to be able to then challenge those assertions that there's confidence. And who said it they were confident? Do I trust them that it's confident? And again, it isn't how many people said yes, it's which ones accurately said yes.
Yeah, I think the panel is evoking wonderful discussions about multiple perspectives, and we'll put this in the context of the law enforcement community, is when I look at things like with our case management systems and all that, we heavily restrict who has access to the case management systems. We also, within our case management systems, we also do validity of sources in terms of whether it's an A-val or a B-val or a good source. But we heavily restrict those things. But then there are other aspects of the law enforcement act thing, whether it's like an open beer container on a park, someone's drinking beer on a park, and we do a citation on that. Does it really matter if that data is bad or not? And I look at those things in the broader context of it, whether things are cloud, and following back to the thought, whether it's a chain of custody type of activity in Department of Interior. We have a lot of things that have to deal with forensics. We have bad actors, and also, you know, if you're on a cyber panel, all those bad things that are happening that we all tend to enjoy. But we have that aspect related to what data needs to be truly integral, and we can trust that where the sourcing is. And then there's other kinds of data and all that where maybe it's the mass of the data and all that that give us a true type of picture. Because we've got like applications outside of the law enforcement where we have literally thousands of sensors, whether it's looking at stream gauges or volcanic eruptions. It doesn't really matter if 5, 10, 20 of those sensors are bad, because they're going to be overwhelmed by the crowdsourcing activities of giving you an indicator of what is occurring. But there are other facets we need to really come to grips with. And then when I look at the advent of where security is, of LE and the cloud and all of that is, I'm not an LE background at the moment and all that, but I can understand some hesitancy on the part of law enforcement of widely sharing whatever the segmented aspects of what that law enforcement engagement is.
Great. And yes, sir. Right. Roving microphone. Lost my mic.
So a couple points here. I'd like to get the panel's thought around open source and how that's being used, because that gets back to crowdsourcing, that gets back to what people are doing. John had mentioned the term interoperability earlier. I find a challenge. My day job is working with health IT and information exchange. Interoperability is a state in time. It's continuous interoperability. We talk about data, but it's the systems that exchange the data. It's not about the conformance of the message. It's about data semantic interoperability, not syntactic interoperability. Those are huge challenges as we deal with big data. People aren't talking about the quality of the data or the quality of the systems moving the data. So to get to that point, crowdsourcing, open source. What do you think about using open source in where you see cloud going?
Thank you, Mario.
So I'll touch on it briefly. Our APIs that we just completed developing for travel alerts and warnings, we're using the CCAM open source data portal. The key management server is WSO2, which provides implementation for SOAP, REST, JSON, XML. So we absolutely are looking at the implementation of open source. And the additional APIs that are coming, things like latitude and longitude, locations of posts overseas, passport issuance agency locations, visa wait times, country-specific information. All of that will be developed using open source in the stack.
So move testing to the cloud. Do more testing. Do more testing in the cloud.
Okay. More testing in the cloud.
Well, we're looking at part of the open data movement and all of that, and is looking at open source type of activities. I will cite to you, and I'll just cite I'll go back to an operations world and all that, is when running our telecommunications networks and our security types of systems. We use a variety of proprietary systems as well as a lot of open source tools to detect anomalies and behavior about what is occurring on there. When we're looking at in terms of application development, we are encouraging users to, when they've got a lot of, most government agencies are bound by legacy applications and the way they do things and all that. But there always comes a time in a review of an application as have thought of something new in terms of the alternatives analysis and the like. So we are encouraging within the owners of our applications is to look anew about how something can be platformed or be delivered. And so open source activities like Drupal or something like that, we're strongly considering. We are advocates of XML and JSON and then all of that, but we're moving towards those things, particularly when it comes in the context of APIs, and then how do you liberate these files and make them a little more delimited in terms of having the ability that they can be widely shared with others that might have a common synergy.
So while I love this to be all about me, I don't hear any questions from this side of the panel. So, the audience.
I thought it was really interesting your comment about the case management system and that being a really locked down, trusted repository. You have to have certain identity and authorization to be able to access it. And the challenge that I hear a lot from agencies is that data that sits in that locked down vault needs to be shared with law enforcement, another agency, state and local, private sector, whatever it might be. And this is what's unique about data, is that it can easily travel. And there's legitimate business requirements to be able to travel. So I think some of the earlier comments around, when that data leaves, it doesn't matter what cloud it's sitting in or where it started, you need to be able to secure the data itself. Right? It has to be able to carry that protection, that knowledge of who's allowed to see it, what they're allowed to do with it. And that's really, what we need to get to.
Oh, I could kiss you. I won't.
As the name for that, it's called self-protecting objects, or SPO.
I once spoke about that. It's called data independence, right? Data, when it leaves your bounds, should have enough information to identify it, identify its lineage, whether it's trusted, and whether or not someone who opens it should be able to see it or not, right? Apple does this with the MP3 files. I download a file. It's good for 5 devices or so, even though I have 10 in my house to fake it. But if I were to email that to someone on the panel, they could see it. They could see what song it is, what album it came from, but they won't be able to open it because it's somewhat protected.
Well, Sony tried to do that with your Microsoft products too. See how that was a challenge.
Good morning. My name is Donald Cox. I'm with Nova Corporation. Having 20 years of law enforcement experience and working in this analytics field now, the pay and chase model is what we've all been lived with for a while. Excuse me. As I started getting into the analytics, my issue became the Computer Matching Act. What do you feel needs to be changed, if anything, in order to help you do predictive analytics? If I have a single target, computer matching, and it's investigation, Computer Matching Act doesn't apply. If I want to go look at a large pool and put some predictive analytics against it, I have to go get agreements with the agencies that own the data, and that's months and months and months and years. So what Senator Issa started on Capitol Hill with the Data Act and some other things, what's the law enforcement community doing to try to move that along so we can do some predictive analytics?
So no shortage of hard questions. So, how are we allowing people to leverage the data analytics on multiple sources of data in the current environment of the data matching?
Well, for us in the law enforcement community with products like Index, which we rolled out, has a layer of analytics attached to it. So you provide the data from your state, local, federal agency. We provide data in some cases, from our case management system into that environment, and then you can run analytics. This is not I wouldn't say, so it is a technology problem in that we're always evolving analytics and getting better at entity extraction, resolution, and things like latent semantics and other types of technologies. But a lot of it is the policy issues. So if you can share the data, you should. And it needs to be in an environment where it is well understood and it is standardized in a way that whatever analytics you're using knows how to use it. One of the advantages of community cloud solutions is there's an entrance criteria for adding your data to it. So your data comes in, it's just not a mess like it was, often in the past. You think several years ago, you got data on a disk and you didn't know what you got, and you pulled it into your analytics system and you opened it up and you did your ETL process to bring it in, and then who knows what they were thinking in the structure. We can provide in these environments entrance criteria where the XML is clear, the data is of decent quality, and that it's understandable, that it's accessible, and all these sort of things. And then you can provide, then you can run analytics that makes sense over many different data sources. And that's where the standards comes in. I mean, I can't answer the question about, how do we get it all together? I mean, that's all that legally could come together. It would be wonderful to have an ability to tap those sources and as close to real time as possible. So not just copy data that is now old. The phone number changed 5 times between the time it was sent out and the time that you started analyzing it. Certainly we've been looking across the Fed government at options for more sort of real-time ingest. But again, the data has to come standardized. It has to come with all the right security controls, the visibility fields within the XML layer, so you know who can see and do what with the data.
Greg?
I would say NEAM is helping. So if we have a standard way for exchanging data,
10 points.
Give my 10 points also. John got this earlier. So if you have a common way of exchanging data, I mean, obviously, it's, you make that available to those who do have the right to view that data. That sharing, right, becomes a bit easier.
Yeah.
And we're seeing that. I mean, State Department exchanges data with lots of federal entities.
Do we have any hard questions, something that would take the next 5 minutes for the panel to answer? Really, there's one out here, I know it. I'm going to pick on somebody, you know, so sort of stand up. All right, I'm going this way. I see Mr. Holgate in the back. Rick? It says act president. I think I'm allowed to pick on you.
Well, thank you, Don. No, I think the panel has done a great job highlighting a lot of the issues. You know, certainly we, you know, as another fellow law enforcement agency, are struggling with some of the same concepts of how do we migrate more successfully into a cloud-based environment, and how do we do that in a way that is as seamless as possible, and that involves a whole range of issues that I think the panel has touched on, whether it's identities, or how do you integrate across potentially multiple cloud service providers, and how do you maintain the appropriate levels of security in that whole context. So I guess I'd ask the panel, just as a final level of you know, thought or wrap up, is, you know, where do you see the biggest impediments to more aggressive adoption of cloud type services in law enforcement? Of all the things that we talked about, where do you see the greatest impediments, and maybe on the flip side, the greatest opportunities?
Well, I'll tell you the opportunity thing. There's a great incentive right now that a lot of, I mean, states and locals, the federal government as well. I mean, the budgets are getting tighter and tighter. Data is getting bigger and bigger. The ability to use commodity services to lower cost is huge. So there's a huge incentive, we know it, to look at alternative solutions. So I think that's starting to break down a lot of the barriers that even existed a year ago. When we start talking, and cloud means so many things, but when you start talking to your executives about what you're really talking about, outsourcing commodity service, I think they're starting to get it, because they're starting to ask for it, like, what are my options for lessening costs? So there's a lot of opportunity there. I mean, I think that a lot of those impediments are going away, that we're largely just uninformed people that we're concerned.
So all of those people who told me his in the cloud, and I should just tell them they're uninformed. So
well, I'm going to say uninformed isn't the right way. Not,
should that be my talking point back? I'm sorry. Just picking on you a little bit.
Yeah.
So it's a cost driver, but are there other drivers that'll help us get over these cultural issues we have with the law enforcement and security of data in the cloud? I will ask that one, or leave you with another challenge. How are we securing data in the mobile environment? That's very much a part of connecting to these clouds in a way that builds trust and gets us beyond you know, some of the issues we've got with law enforcement.
I'll just open it up just ever so briefly. Is when we look at our law enforcement environment and all that, is they've got multiple drivers of what they're supposed to be doing. And so I look at our folks in the field. As you go into any patrol car, you got about 5 or 6 devices that you're using, whether it's for land mobile, whether it's for frequency management, whether it's interactions with other federal agencies, with state and local. So the aspects in terms of, is there a true enterprise architecture with regards to law enforcement activities and all that, that is still a work in progress. There are facets in regards to moving a law enforcement application out into the cloud, or the type of law enforcement application out in the cloud, and it's coming to grips with what all types of cloud providers are doing, and that is how the ability to be able to do continuous monitoring, at least from an agency perspective, on what is occurring on that application, as well as a more robust aspect with security incident event management things. I know in our world, when it comes to our law enforcement application, the ISOs are pretty good about what's going on in that application. But when we look at our network perimeters and all that, we've got other tools that also occasionally show anomalies. So one of the things that we look at is when we go into the cloud is really a very strong articulation in terms of roles and responsibilities about facets of who's going to be able to provide cloud type of service providers and who's ultimately responsible for that. I know within the Department of the Interior, we're initially approaching these things in a cautious type of manner, of assuring that as we're consolidating some of our LE type of applications, that we have at least are establishing that basis for what we want to look at from a continuous monitoring and security incident management and all that. And then as we consolidate those things, is then maybe look at whether it can go out to a more broader cloud types of facets of work.
Okay.
So impediments, I would say, as we heard this morning from the Presidential Innovation Fellows, many of us are excited about the cultural changes that are coming in procurement, right? So procurement challenges continue to stifle innovation, and there's a real groundswell in federal IT to do something different, right? We see these open source solutions, these modular technologies that can be quickly implemented. Gone are the days of hundreds of developers building a complex solution that only one team knows how to operate, where now we can start to put these modular solutions in place so that we can very quickly change the technology and continue to innovate. So I believe as open source continues to be accepted and proven, that we will continue to see that evolution in the procurement space rapidly accelerate the deployment of technology.
I myself want a few of those free PMFs innovating on my back. John, as the lone industry on our panel, did you sort of want to give some insight into the barriers or opportunities that we've got for cloud? I know we're running a little late, but...
Sure, like I say, I think the biggest barriers we have are simply cultural and governmental, policy-based. So as we look to socially to overcome some of those, work within our agencies and organizations to do it, I think technology stands at the forefront, the ability to implement those as we take and reassess those and do that. So I honestly think the biggest barrier is not the technology.
I would iterate. I think the biggest barrier is trust, in particular in the law enforcement community. Trust in people and networks of people who sign on to systems. That's really important. And FICAM and a lot of the sort of work that we're doing is really targeted at that. I sort of own FICAM for DHS. A lot of activity there. Trust in information, trust in the data. We are all getting better at that. But the trust in the sort of the process of how I use these systems and when they're used inappropriately, I think the government's got some work to do on those. And I would leave you saying that we're a little over. I think we've got one comment or question.
I was just going to say more about the communication. I mean, it's one thing to trust, but if you don't have the appropriate communication to the different levels, I mean, we hear up above, how we're going to be bringing this information down, but you go to the second and third level, and if you haven't told, it's the old analogy, you tell two people, well, that's all well and good, but if only one of those two people tells their troops and not the other one, you've got a breakdown of trust. It's all about the communication in between the interagency. We call that in-reach. And that's where we continuously see how can we help when we've got to be able to drive the communication to build that trust too. So.
Have a round of applause for the awesome panel.